Jenna, a quiet and underappreciated accountant, discovers her corrupt boss, David Lancaster, has been embezzling millions while his employees suffer under his oppressive rule. Fueled by anger and a thirst for justice, she orchestrates a brilliant scheme to expose his crimes and bring him down. But just as her plan succeeds, Jenna's own secret begins to unravel. A shadow from within the company knows what she's done and threatens to expose her unless she plays along. As Jenna navigates blackmail, betrayal, and unexpected twists, she learns that revenge comes with a dangerous price, and the battle for justice might just destroy her too. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to orchestrate revenge. Growing up, I always believed in doing the right thing, trusting the system, and playing fair. But life has a funny way of showing you how naive you are, and nothing opened my eyes more than working for David Lancaster. He was my boss, the kind of man who could charm a room with his fake smile but wouldn't think twice about throwing you under the bus if it meant an extra dollar in his pocket. I thought I could endure it, but I was wrong. This is the story of how I stopped enduring and started fighting back. When I landed the job at Lancaster Furnishings, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. It was one of the most well-known furniture companies in the city, known for its high-end custom designs and hefty price tags. As an accountant, it seemed like the perfect opportunity, a decent paycheck, room for growth, and stability. But from the moment I walked through those shiny glass doors on my first day, I knew something wasn't quite right. David ran the company like it was his personal kingdom. He didn't just demand respect, he demanded worship. Employees were expected to cater to his every whim, whether it was staying late to finish his projects, laughing at his terrible jokes in meetings, or applauding his ridiculous speeches about vision and success. And if you dared to cross him, well, you wouldn't be around long enough to regret it. At first, I stayed out of his way. I worked hard, kept my head down, and avoided any drama. But it didn't take long to see how toxic the workplace really was. Overtime was expected but never paid. Promotions were dangled in front of people like carrots, only to be snatched away with excuses about budget constraints. And David always seemed to have money for himself, new cars, expensive watches, first-class vacations. Meanwhile, the rest of us could barely afford a weekend getaway. The breaking point came during a company meeting. It was late November, and everyone was counting on their end-of-year bonuses to help with holiday expenses. For some of my co-workers, it was the only thing keeping them afloat after months of unpaid overtime. But when David walked into the room that day, he had bad news, or so he said. Unfortunately, he began, pacing dramatically at the front of the room, due to unforeseen challenges this year, we won't be able to issue bonuses. I want you all to know this decision wasn't made lightly. I value each and every one of you, and I hope we can work together to make next year even better. I sat there, my hands clenched under the table, watching his crocodile tears. He had the nerve to talk about challenges when he'd just bought himself a brand new Maserati, which was conveniently parked in the lot for everyone to see. The audacity of it made my blood boil. I glanced around the room, and I wasn't the only one fuming. People were whispering, shaking their heads, some even on the verge of tears. But no one said anything. We all knew better. After that meeting, I couldn't shake the anger. It followed me home, keeping me up at night. How could he get away with this? How could someone be so selfish, so cruel? The injustice of it all burned in my chest, but I felt powerless. What could I do? David was untouchable, wealthy, well-connected, and protected by a team of lawyers who would crush anyone who tried to take him on. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I discovered his secret. I was working late, alone in the office, trying to clean up some discrepancies in the accounts. Lancaster Furnishings had dozens of vendors, and part of my job was to make sure their invoices matched our payments. It was routine work, tedious, but necessary. But as I went through the files, something caught my eye, an invoice from a company I didn't recognize, marked as paid. The company name was Global Imports Limited, and the amount was substantial, $35,000 for premium wood materials. I pulled up the payment records and saw that the money had been wired to an offshore account. That wasn't unusual in itself, many vendors used international accounts. But when I checked our supply logs, there was no record of any materials being delivered from Global Imports Limited. Nothing. It was as if the company didn't exist. Curious, I decided to dig a little deeper. I searched through the database for other payments to Global Imports and found a pattern: monthly payments, ranging from $25,000 to $50,000, all going to the same offshore account. The more I looked, the more suspicious it seemed. My heart started pounding as I pieced it together. This wasn't a vendor. This was a front. David was siphoning money out of the company. I sat back in my chair, stunned. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. David wasn't just a greedy boss, he was a criminal. He was stealing from his own company, from the employees who worked overtime without pay, from the people who counted on those bonuses to make ends meet. The sheer scale of it made me sick. For a moment, I considered reporting it. I could call the authorities, hand over the evidence, and let them deal with it. But then I thought about David's lawyers, his connections, his ability to spin any situation to his advantage. Would anyone even believe me? And even if they did, what would happen? He'd pay some fines, maybe spend a few months in a cushy white-collar prison, and then go right back to his life of luxury. Meanwhile, the rest of us would still be struggling. That's when I realized I didn't just want to expose him. I wanted to destroy him. David had spent years exploiting people like me, using us to build his empire while he lived like a king. It was time for him to feel what it was like to lose everything. The idea scared me at first. I wasn't a criminal. I'd never even gotten a parking ticket, let alone planned something like this. But the more I thought about it, the more determined I became. If David could steal from us without remorse, why should I feel guilty about taking him down? It wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. He needed to be held accountable, and if no one else was willing to do it, I would. And so, I started planning. The first thing I did was gather evidence. I spent weeks going through the accounts, documenting every suspicious transaction I could find. I printed copies of invoices, payment records, and bank transfers, storing them in a secure folder on my laptop. I even took screenshots of emails where David had authorized payments to fake vendors. By the time I was done, I had a mountain of evidence that painted a clear picture of his scheme. But I knew that wasn't enough. If I wanted to bring David down, I had to do more than expose his fraud. I had to hit him where it hurt: his reputation, his finances, and his ego. He needed to lose everything, just like he'd made so many of us lose our faith, our dignity, and our hope. It was a dangerous game I was about to play, and there were moments when I doubted myself. What if I got caught? What if he found out what I was doing? But every time those fears crept in, I thought about that meeting, about the way he'd lied to our faces while living off the money he'd stolen from us. And just like that, my resolve hardened. I was ready to begin. David Lancaster had no idea that his carefully constructed empire was about to crumble beneath him. He sat in his lavish corner office every day, smug as ever, while I worked quietly in the background, meticulously building the foundation for his downfall. It was strange, really, watching him laugh, bark orders, and bask in his false sense of security, completely unaware that the person he probably considered invisible was about to dismantle everything he'd ever built. The first step in my plan was creating a fake company, one so convincing that even David wouldn't question its legitimacy. I knew it had to be perfect. David was greedy, but he wasn't stupid. If anything about the company seemed off, he'd sniff it out in an instant. So I spent weeks researching, learning everything I could about how vendors operated, what contracts looked like, and how to create the illusion of a thriving business. The result was Summit Lux Designs, a high-end furniture supplier that looked as real as any of the company's legitimate vendors. I built a sleek website with photos of custom furniture designs I'd pulled from the internet, complete with glowing testimonials from fake clients. I even created a business email address and registered the company with a virtual office service, giving it a legitimate-looking address in a prestigious downtown area. To anyone on the outside, Summit Luxe was just another player in the luxury furniture market. Of course, none of this would have worked if I didn't know how David operated. By then, I'd worked at Lancaster Furnishings long enough to understand his patterns. He loved working with small, boutique vendors because it gave him more opportunities to manipulate pricing and create extra expenses that no one questioned. He also preferred vendors who didn't demand too much oversight, companies that were happy to get paid without asking too many questions. In other words, Summit Luxe Designs was exactly the kind of vendor David would jump at the chance to work with. But before I could introduce Summit Luxe to the company, I needed to create a plausible reason for David to notice it. That's where Claire, his personal assistant, came in. Claire was young, overworked, and, like the rest of us, severely underpaid. She hated David as much as I did, but she was too scared to stand up to him. We weren't exactly friends, but we'd bonded over our shared frustrations during late nights at the office. One evening, after most of the staff had gone home, I casually struck up a conversation with her in the break room. "Busy day?" I asked, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "Always," she sighed, leaning against the counter. "David wants the vendor list updated by tomorrow morning. Apparently, some of the suppliers aren't meeting his standards." "Typical," I said, shaking my head. "You know, I came across this furniture supplier recently. Summit Luxe Designs. They're supposed to be top-notch. Might be worth passing along to him." Claire raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting new vendors now? Brave." I laughed, keeping it light. "Just trying to help. Maybe if he had better suppliers, he wouldn't have so much to complain about." She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. The next day, I saw Summit Luxe Designs listed among the potential vendors in the updated file Claire had prepared for David. Phase 1 of the plan was complete. It didn't take long for David to bite. A week later, he called a meeting with the procurement team to discuss adding Summit Luxe to the roster. I sat in the back of the room, pretending to take notes, as he skimmed through the vendor portfolio I'd so carefully created. "Summit Luxe Designs," he said, tapping his finger on the page. "This looks promising. High-end materials, boutique operation, based downtown. Exactly the kind of partner we need for our premium line." The procurement manager nodded. "Should we reach out to set up a meeting?" David shook his head. "No need. Start small, place a test order and see how they perform. If they deliver, we'll scale up." I hid my smirk behind my notebook. He'd taken the bait, just as I'd hoped. Over the next few weeks, I used the Summit Luxe email account to correspond with Lancaster Furnishings, confirming orders and sending invoices. I made sure everything looked professional, even throwing in a few minor delays to keep it realistic. David didn't seem to notice, or care. As long as the invoices were paid and the orders appeared to be progressing, he was satisfied. But the real genius of Summit Luxe Designs wasn't in the fake invoices or the phantom deliveries. It was in the trap I was setting behind the scenes. Using the login credentials I'd borrowed from Claire, she always left her sticky notes with passwords lying around. I gained access to David's personal email account. It was there that I found something truly incriminating: detailed records of his offshore accounts. He had multiple accounts in the Cayman Islands, all under shell companies, and they were loaded with money he'd siphoned from Lancaster Furnishings over the years. I wasn't surprised, but I was furious all over again. This man had stolen millions from his own company while crying budget constraints to justify cutting bonuses and freezing raises. He didn't deserve to get away with it. And now, I had everything I needed to make sure he didn't. Using the information I'd gathered, I created a fake paper trail linking Summit Lux designs to David's offshore accounts. On paper, it looked like Summit Lux was paying David under the table for favorable treatment, a classic case of kickbacks. I even included fake emails from Summit Lux to David, thanking him for his partnership and promising a mutually beneficial arrangement. It was perfect. The evidence was damning, and it all pointed to him. But I wasn't done yet. The final step in my plan was to ensure that David's fraudulent activities came to light in the most public and humiliating way possible. To do that, I needed help from someone outside the company, someone who had the power to expose him without implicating me. That's when I thought of the investors. Lancaster Furnishings had a group of high-profile investors who'd sunk millions into the company. They were always hovering in the background, demanding quarterly reports and scrutinizing financial statements. David hated them, but he needed their money to keep the business afloat. If they found out he'd been embezzling funds, they'd tear him apart. I decided to send an anonymous tip. Using a secure email service, I composed a message detailing David's fraudulent activities and attached copies of the evidence I'd fabricated. I kept the tone neutral, presenting myself as a concerned employee who'd stumbled upon something troubling. Then I hit send. All I had to do now was wait. The days after I sent the anonymous tip felt like the calm before a storm. On the surface, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. David carried on as if he were untouchable, barking orders, scheduling meetings, and flaunting his Maserati like it was a badge of honor. But beneath the surface, I knew the wheels were already turning. The investors wouldn't ignore a tip like that, especially one with the kind of evidence I'd sent them. It was only a matter of time before the fallout began. The first sign came in the form of an unannounced visit. One Friday morning, just as the office was settling into its usual rhythm, a group of men in expensive suits walked through the front door. They weren't the usual investors we'd seen in the past. These men looked serious, their expressions cold and calculating. I watched from my desk as they headed straight for David's office, brushing past his assistant without so much as a hello. "What's going on?" Claire whispered to me as she peeked over her computer. "I don't know," I lied, feigning ignorance. "They don't look happy, though." Inside his office, David greeted the men with his usual arrogance, shaking hands and flashing that fake smile of his. But the moment the door closed behind them, his demeanor changed. Through the glass walls, I could see his confident posture falter as the men began speaking. One of them slid a thick folder across the desk, and David's face went pale as he opened it. He didn't look so untouchable anymore. For the rest of the day, David stayed locked in his office with the men, his voice occasionally rising in anger before dropping to a tense murmur. By the time they left, it was clear something major had shifted. David emerged from his office looking shaken, his usual bravado replaced with a stiffness that made him seem smaller. But that was just the beginning. The following Monday, rumors started swirling. People whispered in the break room, at their desks, and even in the elevator. Word had gotten out that the investors had ordered an audit of the company's finances. Apparently, they'd received an anonymous tip about irregularities in the accounts, and they weren't taking any chances. David tried to play it cool, addressing the staff during a hastily called meeting in the conference room. "There's nothing to worry about," he said, pacing in front of the group like a caged animal. "The investors are conducting a routine review of our financials. It's standard procedure. Business will continue as usual." He didn't fool anyone. The cracks in his armor were starting to show, and everyone could see it. His normally booming voice lacked its usual confidence, and his forced smile didn't reach his eyes. For the first time since I'd started working there, David looked vulnerable. Meanwhile, I kept my head down and continued playing the role of the oblivious accountant. I didn't want to draw any attention to myself, especially not now. But inside, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The trap I'd set was closing in on him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The audit was brutal. Over the next 2 weeks, a team of forensic accountants combed through every transaction, every invoice, every email. They left no stone unturned, and it wasn't long before they started finding things that didn't add up. The fake vendor payments to Summit Lux Designs were the first red flag. From there, it didn't take much digging to uncover the offshore accounts and the missing funds. David, of course, denied everything. He claimed he had no knowledge of the fake vendor and suggested that someone in the accounting department must have made an error. But the evidence was overwhelming. The auditors traced the payments directly to his offshore accounts, and the emails I'd fabricated made it look like he'd been in on it the whole time. Watching him squirm was deeply satisfying. Every day, I saw him grow more and more paranoid, snapping at employees, barking orders, and storming out of meetings. He spent hours locked in his office, making frantic phone calls that, from the muffled tone of his voice, sounded increasingly desperate. It was like watching a man slowly drown, and I couldn't help but enjoy every second of it. Things took a dramatic turn when the investors called an emergency board meeting. The entire office buzzed with speculation as David and the senior executives disappeared behind closed doors. I wished I could have been a fly on the wall, but I didn't need to be there to know how it went. By the time the meeting ended, the look on David's face said it all. He'd lost. That afternoon, an email went out to the entire staff announcing that David Lancaster was stepping down as CEO, effective immediately. The email framed it as a personal decision, citing a desire to focus on other opportunities, but everyone knew the truth. David hadn't stepped down, he'd been forced out. As I read the email, I couldn't help but smile. This was it. The king had fallen. But the consequences didn't stop there. Over the next few days, news of the scandal broke in the local press. An anonymous whistleblower had revealed that David Lancaster had been embezzling funds from his own company for years. The articles detailed the fake vendors, the offshore accounts, and the massive sums of money that had gone missing. It wasn't long before national outlets picked up the story, and David became a symbol of corporate greed gone unchecked. The fallout was devastating. The investors sued him for breach of fiduciary duty, demanding that he repay every penny he'd stolen. The IRS launched an investigation into his finances, freezing his accounts and seizing his assets. His mansion, his cars, even his prized Maserati, everything was repossessed. And as if that wasn't enough, his wife filed for divorce, taking their 2 kids and whatever assets she could claim before the courts got to them. David, the man who once bragged about being untouchable, was left with nothing. The office buzzed with gossip as we watched his downfall play out in real time. No one felt sorry for him, not after everything he'd done. In fact, most people seemed to enjoy watching him get what he deserved. It was poetic justice, plain and simple. As for me, I stayed quiet. I didn't want anyone to suspect my involvement, so I played dumb, acting just as surprised as everyone else when the news broke. But inside, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. David had spent years exploiting others, using his power and influence to take whatever he wanted without consequence. And now, he was finally paying the price. But my plan wasn't finished just yet. There was still one last move to make, and it was going to ensure that David never recovered. The office felt like a completely different place after David's downfall. His name was whispered in hushed tones, his old office was locked and left untouched, and a temporary CEO was brought in to clean up the mess he'd left behind. The investors were scrambling to stabilize the company, employees were cautiously optimistic about the future, and I felt victorious, like I had restored balance to a system that had been corrupted for far too long. But life has a way of throwing unexpected twists when you least expect them, and I was about to learn that my carefully planned revenge was far from over. It all started with an envelope. One morning, a courier dropped off a plain manila envelope on my desk. It wasn't addressed to me specifically, just marked, confidential. I assumed it was some routine paperwork and tossed it aside, intending to deal with it later. But something about it nagged at me. The envelope was too thin to be a stack of documents, and the weight felt oddly personal. When I finally opened it, my stomach dropped. Inside was a single piece of paper. On it was a grainy, black and white photograph of me. More specifically, it was of me sitting at my desk late one evening, typing away at my computer. The timestamp in the corner showed it was taken a few weeks ago, right around the time I'd been working on creating the fake Summit Lux paper trail. Underneath the photo was a single, handwritten sentence. "We know what you did." My heart pounded as I stared at the note, panic rising in my chest. Who was "we"? Was this some kind of prank? Or had someone actually figured out my role in David's downfall? I glanced around the office, trying to gauge if anyone was watching me, but everything seemed normal. People were at their desks, chatting, typing, completely unaware of the chaos spiraling in my head. I shoved the photo back into the envelope and stuffed it into my bag. I couldn't let anyone see it, not until I figured out what was going on. For the next few days, I was on edge. Every email I received, every glance from a coworker, every ring of my phone sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I combed through my plan over and over, looking for any loose ends I might have missed. Had I left a trace? Was there a piece of evidence that could tie me to the Summit Lux scheme? It didn't seem possible. I'd been so careful, covering my tracks, working late when no one was around, even using a secure VPN to hide my IP address when creating the fake documents. There was no way anyone could link it back to me. And yet, the photo was proof that someone had been watching. But who? The answer came sooner than I expected, and from the last person I ever thought would be involved. It was Claire. She showed up at my apartment one evening, unannounced. I was in the middle of trying to calm myself with a glass of wine when I heard the knock at my door. When I opened it, there she was, standing in the hallway with a smug look on her face and that same manila envelope in her hand. "Can I come in?" she asked, as if she already knew the answer. I stepped aside, my stomach churning. Claire walked in like she owned the place, glancing around before settling on my couch. She tossed the envelope onto my coffee table and crossed her legs, clearly enjoying my discomfort. "I know everything," she said, leaning back with a smirk. "Summit Lux. The fake invoices. The offshore accounts. All of it." I froze. My mind raced as I tried to figure out how she could have possibly connected the dots. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, trying to sound calm. "Oh, don't play dumb," she scoffed. "I've been watching you for months. You think I didn't notice you snooping through David's emails? Or the way you conveniently worked late every night while all of this was going down? You're not as sneaky as you think." My blood ran cold. I'd underestimated her, written her off as just another underpaid assistant who was too beaten down to care. But Claire had been paying attention all along, and now she had me cornered. "What do you want?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. There was no use denying it anymore. She grinned, clearly pleased with how quickly I'd folded. "Relax, I'm not here to rat you out. In fact, I think what you did was brilliant. Watching David crash and burn was the highlight of my year." Her smile faded, and her tone turned serious. "But you didn't think I'd let you walk away from this scot-free, did you?" My stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you're not the only one who deserves a slice of the pie," she said, leaning forward. "Do you really think I'd work for that scumbag for peanuts while he bought cars and mansions? I've been waiting for an opportunity like this, and you handed it to me on a silver platter. What do you want?" I asked again, my voice shaking. "Half," she said simply. "Of whatever you took." I blinked, stunned. "What are you talking about?" I didn't. "Oh, cut the crap," she snapped. "You think I don't know about the money you funneled into your personal account before deleting the Summit Lux records? I may not have all the details, but I know enough. So here's the deal, you transfer half of it to me by the end of the week, or I send this, she gestured to the envelope, to the investors, the IRS, and anyone else who might find it interesting. My head spun. I hadn't expected this. Claire wasn't just blackmailing me, she was threatening to unravel everything I'd worked for. If she exposed me, I wouldn't just lose my job, I'd be facing legal action, possibly even prison time. I had no choice. At least, not yet. I agreed to her terms, but as soon as she left, I started working on my counterstrike. There was no way I was letting Claire hold this over me. She'd underestimated me just as I had underestimated her, and I wasn't about to let her get the upper hand. Over the next few days, I played the role of the obedient victim, pretending to cooperate while secretly plotting my next move. I dug into Claire's background, her emails, her social media, anything I could find that might give me leverage. It didn't take long to discover her Achilles heel. She'd been skimming money from petty cash for months, siphoning small amounts here and there that added up to a significant sum. It wasn't much, but it was enough to threaten her with. I compiled the evidence, sent it to an anonymous tip line at the company, and waited. It didn't take long for the HR department to swoop in, and within days, Claire was escorted out of the building. She never saw it coming. With Claire gone, the threat of exposure vanished, and I was free to enjoy the fruits of my labor. The money I'd siphoned from the Summit Lux scheme remained untouched, safely hidden in an account under a new name. David's empire was in ruins, Claire was out of the picture, and I was untouchable. Or so I thought. Because weeks later, I received another envelope. This one didn't contain a photo or a note. Instead, it was a single line of text printed on plain white paper. Just because you got rid of Claire doesn't mean it's over. No signature. No clue as to who had sent it. And just like that, I realized, I wasn't the only one watching David. And I wasn't the only one who knew.